everyone, and welcome to the Talkish podcast. My name is Heidi. Join us as we embark on a journey of self discovery to liberate and heal the mind, body, and spirit. And we do all this by talking ish. So, Justin's not here today. However, this is a moment that I've been waiting for a very, very long time. In his place, I have two beautiful, awe-inspiring women who have inspired my life, who, if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't even be here today. We have my beautiful mother, Gwendolyn Louise Talkish, and my godmother, who I am named after, who my middle name is named after. My middle name is Antoinette, but we call her godmother Toni Embry. Everybody, welcome them to the show. Thank you guys for being here with us today. So, I wanted to start off this conversation by, first off, talking about how you two met, where you guys met, and one by one, I want you to talk about your journey that led up to where you met. So, Mom, you could start first.
Well, Tony was my younger sister's friend,
Hmm.
younger sister Monica, because they were born the same year. I was a few years older than her. I always heard about Tony, but I was, in my own teenage years. I wasn't really in my college years. So she wasn't really in my circle until our churches were affiliated. Uh, Her pastor was at one point the district elder to our church in Pittsburgh. So our churches were affiliated, but I didn't personally know her. I just knew some of the older people who had gone to her church. Then once I quit college, another story, and joined the church. And then I married your dad. And your dad and her husband were the only ex-husband, but at the time they were the only two white people in the church.
Yeah.
And so we kind of bonded through that, and we were we were having, since they were best friends in the church, she and I became best friends in that church and started having babies year after year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right,
And
right.
what about you?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. You know, her Monica was definitely my good friend. She was actually in my wedding,
Hmm.
and the night before my wedding, she literally stayed at my house because she was my either my bridesmaid or my maid of honor. I can't remember.
The bridesmaid. Yeah.
Bridesmaid, yeah. But her and I was. She was such a sweet person, and still is. She hasn't changed.
Yeah.
Um, but I believe she went back to Pittsburgh. Is that correct?
At that time.
Yeah, she went back to Pittsburgh, and Gwen had um, finally moved to Erie,
Yeah.
and we just clicked.
Yeah.
I mean, when our our ex husbands got together and became friends, and they had interest in us. First it was Gwen, then it was me. Um, we just clicked and have been friends ever since. I think we've been friends over what, 47
It's about
years?
47 years.
Wow.
47 years.
That is amazing.
And she's my big sister. The sister that I've never, my older sister that I never had.
That's because you're the oldest girl, right? In your
Yeah,
family.
I'm the oldest in my family,
Okay.
and everybody, being the oldest, looked up to me, and I was, well, who am I going to look up to?
Yeah, yeah.
She was the one,
Oh, that's awesome.
and I literally followed almost everything, even down to the number of children that we had.
Yes, yes, and we're actually going to get into that.
Yeah.
So the church that you all met in, um, most would consider it, I would consider it a cult.
Yes.
It was a cult.
Mm.
Um, I want you to both describe how somebody who would be considered in their right mind, because I feel like that's a lot of the questions. Who would allow themselves to get into a cult? And I don't think people really understand
Yes.
what that journey is like, that preparation is like, that gets in there. So, can you explain to us how you came about? What led you to this cult like church? And then, after we discuss that, I want to discuss your experience in that church, and especially with your marriages, because both of your marriages were
Hmm.
pretty much arranged.
Yes.
You really didn't have too much of a say so.
We did.
So, I'll start with you this time,
Okay.
on how you came to this church.
Well, actually, I was born into it.
Mm.
My parents were, I would say, my mother, I think she joined when she was about 17, 18. And she came, she was literally swept up into it. And when I was born, it was, she religiously took me, her and my dad took me to church. So much so that by the time I was 5, I was in love, 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 loved church. And if I have a little time, I like to tell a little story on how I love church. My dad, he was in and out a little bit, you know. He was supposedly saved, sanctified, and filled with the Holy Ghost, but he, wasn't involved in church as like my mom. So one particular night, she was trying to get my dad to come to church, and she figured she can leave me at home to try to convince my dad to come to church. So apparently he was watching the Steelers game, and every once in a while, I said, "Daddy, can you let's go to church?" And I'm 5 years old, and so we finally went to church because I mean, to me, it was one of the most beautiful things. You had hand clapping, feet
Yeah.
stomping, and everybody was just excited. I was so excited because I love the music. So finally, when my dad agreed to take me to church, um, we opened the doors. I'll never forget it was big brown doors. We stepped open the doors, and they were doing the benediction. I was so angry with my dad,
Uh,
but that's the pastor was so captivating
mm,
to the point where a 5-year-old little girl was enamored with him.
wow.
And from that point, he was like a god to me. Every word I hung on to, his words were so like um, persuasive
Yeah.
that I didn't believe anything, and I would do anything he told me to do.
Yeah. Mm,
So if it to the point where if he told me to jump off the cliff,
wow.
in my case, he encouraged me to get married very early. So we could talk about that later. But that's how so basically I was groomed.
Yes, absolutely.
And
It's a straight grooming process.
yes,
Yes. I mean,
absolutely.
yeah, typical grooming.
Right.
And yes, we will absolutely get back to that. I just wanted to quickly talk about you, Mom, and your journey on how you became
Well,
a part of this church.
well, my parents they migrated from the South
Hmm.
to Pennsylvania. My dad was in the military, and he was stationed outside of Pittsburgh on one of the military bases outside of Pittsburgh. But when he was discharged from the service, they had a choice of which places they were going to move to. My mom, being a romantic woman did not want to live down south close to my dad's family or her family. She wanted to get away from the violence of the South. So they chose a little place outside of Pittsburgh.
Hmm.
A little, ended up being a little rural ghetto
Lincoln
outside,
Beach.
yeah, Lincoln Beach,
There's no
outside
beach.
of Pittsburgh.
No, it
No
is not a
beach.
beach.
It's
It
not a
is not a
beach.
beach. You got a little
It's a
creek in the
creek.
back. Yeah. Uh-huh.
But anyway, but dad, they were both raised up in a Baptist church. They both had seen a lot of what they call hypocrisy, where the deacons of the church would be, singing and praising and praying and crying to God on Sunday morning, but on Saturday night they would have been in as my dad called it, the beer garden, all night womanizing.
Mm,
And Daddy wanted to be authentic. He did not want that if he was going to follow God, he wanted to follow something he felt was authentic. And so there was a church in Lincoln Beach called Bethlehem Temple Faith Church. Now, this is outside of Pittsburgh. And at that time, the pastor, the Tony, her pastor was our district elder. But anyway, that church was like a holiness or hell
Okay.
church.
Yes.
There was no playing around.
Mm-hmm.
There was no, you were either going to live for God or you weren't going to live for God. There was no in betweens. And so that's why Daddy chose that church. And my mom initially didn't was not into it as much, but I guess she and Dad were having marital issues. And so my dad was the first one that went to the church. And he, in that type of church, you say you're going to live for God and you're immediately baptized and then you immediately speak in tongues or whenever once you get the Holy Ghost, then now you're a part of that church.
Yeah, yeah.
Then mommy joined the church, to be close to my dad. And so they were both going there together. I was about 5 years old when I first went to church. And so it was a faith church. And so the faith part of it was something I needed a healing
Mm-hmm.
because at that time I had an infection in one of the bones of my skull, and uh, it was an emergency surgery that I needed to. The mastoid bone of my skull needed to be
Mm-hmm.
drained and drilled and drained, and I remember asking for the pastor. Her name was Sister Bennett because they told my dad if I didn't have the surgery, I would get meningitis and I would die, and I didn't want the surgery. So I told my dad, well, a Sister Bennett who lived 20 miles away from us, and she didn't have a vehicle, and it was emergency surgery. If she could come and pray for me, I'd be healed. And mom and dad were like, the doctor said you needed surgery, but I was like saying no, and I remember the word faith, and that's what I was taught, faith church. And so I remember they shaved my head. I was in the pediatric unit, and I was awaiting surgery. And the doctor came in throughout the night. They had done an X-ray, and he was extremely angry, and because he couldn't find the infection.
Mm.
And he took the light. He was shoving it in my ear, and through the night, God had healed me of this mastoiditis
Wow.
without a scar, without surgery. So through that, I had an experience, a real experience with God. And um, even though it was a cult, the preaching was, to me, it was real,
Yes.
and I always related back to that healing.
Mm-hmm.
And you hear other testimonies of other people getting delivered, getting set free, getting healed. So that was my first experience with that church and my local pastors. Later on, there was a division between my pastor and her pastor.
Mm-hmm.
So they said my pastor was no longer was excommunicated, and so we looked to her pastor in Erie for guidance, and so that was like kind of down through the years. So and that's kind of coming up, but that's how we were introduced to that type of
Yeah.
lifestyle
To the church.
to the
Yeah.
church
Yeah,
because
so it was the same kind of process, like a grooming type of, like,
there,
you were pretty much born into it too. It was just a different church,
yeah.
so it was very natural transition for you to go into that church.
But I just want to point out that, like you said, it you it was not like any type of church. It was different. It's a different cut than the regular
Oh yeah,
church because of the power that we saw exhibited
Right.
there. That at that time,
I think that um, you both mentioned it well. It was a faith church, so it was really really heavily reliant. And I know talking to you both yesterday. And even today, and I'm hearing about your testimony. It had a lot to do with faith. And then eventually, I really want to get to actually while we're on faith. I want to talk. I want you to also tell about your sister's miraculous healing, and we'll link the two
And
on
my mom.
faith.
Yeah.
Yeah, and your yeah.
Mhm.
So you want to talk about that really quick?
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's start with my mom
Yes.
because that's the first time when I experienced uh, God's healing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, my mom, one morning, well, leading up to it, I noticed she had not been feeling well and sleeping a lot. And I was 10 years old, and she asked me to help her with my siblings. There were seven of us. So I did. So that morning before I went to school, she said, Toni, I need you to help me get the kids ready for school. So I did that. Um, and after I came home from school, she was always home to greet us.
Mm-hmm.
This particular day, she wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lady, her name was Sister Ida.
Yeah.
She was at the stove cooking, and but she had this somber look on her face. I knew, immediately knew there was something wrong. So I said, "Where's mom? Where's mama?" And she told me that she was in the hospital. I later found out um, that she through my grandmother, her mom, everybody started coming in from out of town, everywhere, but nobody would tell me what happened until a few days later. My grandmother sat me down, and this was I knew something was really wrong because I could hear her walking the floor
Mm.
and crying. So she finally sat me down and told me what happened. Turns out she had kidney failure
Mm.
so bad. I don't know the medical term, but
Mm.
her blood and urine had mixed together. That's the way it was explained to
Mm.
me.
Yeah.
And they also told me that the doctor only gave her one night to live.
Wow.
Had she lived, though, through the night, that she would be nothing but a vegetable.
Mm.
That night, it was a Wednesday night, and usually we had Wednesday Bible study. The whole church stood in unison and cried out to God.
Wow.
She lived 8 years after that.
Wow.
So she wasn't fully healed, but she lived long enough until I was 18
Yeah.
to raise us as far as she could.
Yeah.
She ended up passing away at 39.
Mm-hmm.
But before that happened, my sister Stacy, she had epilepsy, and we weren't aware of that. So this one particular time, she was standing at the top of the stairs when she had an episode. Um, so consequently, she fell down the stairs, and then later we found that she was paralyzed from the waist down. She couldn't walk, and to make a long story short, she had such strong faith. If Bishop could just lay his hands on her, that she would be healed. I remember her saying that.
Wow.
So that particular Sunday, um, she was in a wheelchair. Her best friend, her name was Stacy, wheeled her up. Um, he beckoned for her to come, and she went up the long aisle, and he got the oil and put the oil on her forehead, and he started praying, and he's in the name of Jesus,
Mm.
rise and walk. So he took her hands, arms, and he helped lift her up. And I could see her legs were like this.
Wow.
I could see it. I'm like, oh my God, she can't walk.
Wow.
You know, I didn't really believe it,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And when I saw her legs just like jello, I couldn't believe it. My heart just fell. And my mom was bawling. And so all of a sudden, she started dancing. She started a little bit, and next thing you know, she was dancing It just makes me cry now. But she was dancing all over the church
Wow.
and lit the church up on fire.
Wow.
And my mom was just bawling.
Wow.
So that was my second experience with the faith, with God's healing.
Yeah.
Um, so those two were my experiences.
So that thank you for sharing, both of you. I wanted to really, really drill this in to the viewers that, these are supernatural events that
Yeah,
happen to both of
yeah,
you all. Um, but what one thing happens in these churches with these charismatic leaders is we attribute those miracles to the person that
yeah,
is, we're not looking at that person as an actual vessel of the spirit to work through.
right.
We end up making that person the deity, the God, whether we call them God or not. We look to them and their word as being law. So can we talk about um, the 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 charismatic leader? We're not going to mention his name, but can we talk about the charismatic leader, and also talk about how you both came to meeting your husbands in the church, and how your marriages were arranged, and what the pastor's advice was to both of you all.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. There's actually, like I said before, I was groomed
Mhm.
as a young child through my mom also, to believe that he was the authentic person who was credible, who was a person that you can trust totally unconditionally,
Mhm.
that he would not leave you down the road, the wrong road. And actually, his word was law. You did not cross. And it wasn't like he used a stick, but mentally he did.
Wow.
Okay. So, my mom, at this time, my mom was estranged from my dad. And so, consequently, my pastor was my father and my religious father, who I looked up to, which made him more even influential in my life. Uh, so at the time when I was 14, I noticed this man. He was looking at me and literally staring at me.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking to myself, why is he staring at me? And I knew it, and I felt in my heart that there was something wrong about it, but I didn't mention it to anybody. Looking back, I probably should have. So one day, on a Sunday morning, um, he approached me and he sat me down. He said, "Can I talk to you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said to me, "You seem to be very mature for your age,
Mm.
and I like the way you are spiritual and how much you go to church and how much you love God." And I can't remember verbatim what he said, but it was something to the simple. And he asked me, he said, "I want you to be my wife.
Wow.
Will you be my wife?" And I said, "What?" And my first impulse was to say no.
Wow.
But I thought about it. I was like, wait, this may be a blessing from God. And I went home and told my mom about it. And she looked at me. She said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah. What should I do?" And she laughed, tickled, and turned around, walked, and she's away from me. And I said, "Mom, what do I do?" She said, "It's up to you."
Mm.
And and I said, "I don't know what to do, Mom." And she said, "It's up to you." Later did I find out the reason why she said that is because of the scripture that said, "Do not forbid marriage."
Oh, wow.
And because I was beyond the flower age,
Can
that
I
it
just
was,
say misinterpretation of that
yes,
scripture?
yes. And I think everyone knows what that means.
Yeah.
That I was ready to be married.
Wow.
Um, Prior to that, I found out later that my ex husband and her ex husband, your dad,
Yeah.
were best friends, and they lived together, and they happened to be talking about marrying black women.
Wow.
And so the question came up, was like, well, what do you think about black women? And my name came up. Well, what do you think about Toni? And her ex-husband was like, yeah, why not? So that's why he approached me.
Wow.
Um,
How old were you and how old was he at the time?
oh, good question. I was 15 and he was 28.
Wow.
Yes. So I'm trying to be a good, safe person, wanting to make sure that I was doing God's will,
Obedient.
obedient,
Hmm.
and I had asked for a meeting with our pastor, and so he talked to me, and I said, "Brother so and so asked me to marry him, and I wanted to know your thoughts on that." And he said to me, "Well, Sister Toni, that's up to you." And then he says, I can't remember verbatim what he said, but he basically said, "That's up to you." I'm 15 years old. What am I supposed to do with that?
Yeah.
So at so I said, okay, I'm going to pray about it. I fasted almost every day. I would go on a 3-day fast in
Wow.
increments for 30 days. And I got so thin. And I prayed and I prayed and I fasted. And I still didn't really have an answer.
Hmm.
So apparently, my ex husband must have made a call to a bishop, and Bishop calls my house.
Wow.
And it was like the God of heaven
Hmm.
calling my house.
Yeah.
And my mom, at first he called, talked to my mom, and they put me on three-way and on the other phone. And she said, Bishop is on the other line. And he was like, Sister Toni, uh, what? I understand that you haven't give brother so and so an answer. And I was like, well, I don't know what to do. And he said, well, either you say yes or say no. If you say yes, okay. But if you say no, he will be able to go on with his life. So I thought about it, and I said yes.
Mm.
And that was the beginning of the next part of my life.
There was a point in time where you had second thoughts.
Oh, I
And
did.
what happened with that?
I overrode it
Hmm.
because of my mother, who was, like, she was also groomed. And because Bishop did not discourage it, and and by telling her not to forbid marriage, she allowed her 15-year-old
Yeah.
to entertain the marriage. I think I'm sure that it really disturbed her, but she, you
Yeah.
know,
How do you question?
explained it.
Yeah. How
Yeah,
do you question
explained it
God?
away. Absolutely,
But,
absolutely.
but you, I remember you were telling me about there was a situation prior to you actually tying the knot that you came to the bishop.
Yeah.
What was that conversation?
Yes.
You're engaged.
Yeah, I was engaged by then.
Okay.
And we actually, in order to get to know one another, we would see each other almost every week, every couple of days, and we would talk on the phone every day. But this particular time, he was missing in action for an entire week. He wouldn't return my calls. Finally, I went to his house and knocked on his door, and he wouldn't answer the door. No one was there. So I called my pastor and I asked for an appointment. Um, and I told him what was happening. And I said that I wanted to call off the the uh, the yeah the engagement. And he said, "Hold on, let me call brother so and so and talk to him." That day or the following day, he calls me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And I still want to marry you. But deep down in my heart, I knew I probably shouldn't proceed with him. But because of my Christian faith and my belief in the pastor, I moved forward.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
I forgot to mention, though, while I was dating him, he was grooming me as well.
Mm.
There was one of the things, there was no sex before marriage. I hope it's okay to use that word,
Of
but
course.
no sex before marriage. And that was the catalyst, that was the inspiration for both me and I'm sure your dad,
Mm-hmm.
um, reasoning for getting married.
Wow.
It's better get married than to burn. That was
The burn. Yeah.
that was a phrase.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Here I am, this young girl,
15 years old,
15
coming
years
into
old.
your yeah. Mm-hmm.
There were times I had to fight him off.
Wow. Wow.
So can you imagine how
Yeah. That
that,
pressure.
yeah,
Mhm.
It's
that
like yeah.
impacted me?
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So, that's basically how it all came about.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
And so, Mom, can you explain how you came about to meeting Dad and your marriage and your courtship? And I know you had also apprehensions and talked to
Yeah.
this with the bishop, and I wanted to get your take on that whole situation.
Well, being raised in a church, I'll say I always loved God from an early age, but it wasn't until I was 17 that I made that decision to, you know, um, be completely committed to the church. So, um, you give up, you just go with it. And that was in the early 70s. That meant no pants, giving up
Yeah.
pants, giving up makeup,
Yes.
Fingernail
No
polish.
earrings.
no earrings.
Yeah.
It's just
No,
like
no open toe
no open
shoes. You
toed
had to wear
shoes.
pants.
Wow.
I
Yeah,
mean,
long dresses.
pantyhose. Yes.
Yep,
Yeah.
pantyhoses. No
Mm-hmm.
going to movies. I had to drop
Didn't
my
cut your hair.
boyfriend, my
Wow.
first love, the guy who I was in love with. It, I dropped him. It was right before prom. Well, I couldn't go to the prom. No dances.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
So, and then there was still at that time there was still a rift between the church, even though they taught the same. My dad's church and the bishop's church that she went to, there was a split in that organization.
We're running really pressed on
Mhm.
time. I just want to get onto the marriage
So,
and yeah.
so, so I went to college, and um, 2.5 years into college on my bachelor's degree, and I went to my sister's to visit my sister for Christmas break. She went to the church that Tony went to,
Mm-hmm.
and I had no intention on staying there,
Mm-hmm.
but I went there and I sat in his office, and he told me why, if I stayed in the church, my dad's church, that I was doomed to go to hell,
Wow.
Mm.
and I
Wow.
needed to make that decision. So I didn't want to go to hell, so I quit college
Mm.
and
Wow.
moved to to the church that she went to,
Mm-hmm.
and so while I was there, when I moved to that um, church there, but it was 2.5 hours away from where we lived, I met your dad.
Mm-hmm.
Your dad he looked very spiritual.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
He looked very, very
Yes.
serious
Mm.
about God.
Right.
He was always very neat. He was always the first one at church.
Mm-hmm.
He was there every time the church doors opened.
Mm-hmm.
Carried the biggest Bible.
He carried a big Bible. He sat on the front pew,
Yes.
and whenever those worship songs got underway, man, he was the first one to jump up and
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
clap his hands,
Yeah.
and he was very expressive the way he can express the Bible, and
Mm-hmm.
he read the Bible, and he just seemed to have loved the Bible, and he paid attention to me. I wasn't used to men, you know, you know, paying attention to me, especially in the church. All the men were married. There was
Mm-hmm.
no men in the church anyway.
Yeah.
They're all married.
Slim pickings.
Yeah, it was very slim pickings, but he was a single man who paid attention
Uh-huh.
to me. And so we got to talking. Like she says, there was no intimacy
Mm-mm.
before in our courtship,
Yeah.
no holding hands,
Right.
no kissing.
Yeah.
So you don't really get a chance to know these people.
We had to have a chaperone too.
Yeah, we did have to go. We couldn't ride alone in a car with him. We had to have a third person.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever he asked me to marry him, you know, you know, I said yes. Then after a while, because he seemed so spiritual.
Yeah.
Then after a while, it was like I started seeing him, even without intimacy. I saw that he didn't hold down a job, and he had a horrible temper,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't want to marry him.
Yeah.
Once I started to know him, and I went back to Bishop, and I was like, I know I said I would marry him, but I have never seen someone with such unsteady emotions, and and he has not found a job. He promised me he'd find a job, and Bishop says, I'm sorry. You promised you could marry him, and you're engaged. And as far as the Bible is concerned, engagement is still the same as marriage, and you can't break that promise. You'll go to hell. He says, and furthermore, you better be glad someone's looking at you, wanting you
Wow.
to. And so that kind of played on a very low self-esteem
Mm.
that I had on myself as a woman.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Oh, that's so painful to
yeah,
hear.
yeah.
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 So that's why I didn't break the engagement.
Yeah.
And my parents were really afraid of him.
Mm.
They were
He was
afraid
very well
spiritually.
respected.
Oh,
He was
yeah.
respected, but he was
Yeah.
also feared
Wow.
because he had this influence. So they were afraid to step up and say, my daughter's going to finish college, and how dare you interfere with this? They were
Mm-hmm.
very afraid because they believed that if I uh, didn't listen to this pastor, I would go to hell. They want to be responsible for me going to hell. So
Right.
they didn't speak up.
Wow. Kind of goes to show you the saying, power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yes.
And when you feel like you have that absolute power,
Mm.
you don't even, people are looking at you as God, but
Yeah.
you're not even stopping them and saying, no, I'm not God.
Right.
You're not
Yeah.
stopping them. And that's just really
As a matter of
that
fact, he would
power.
brag about it. He would brag about it. He would say, if you come in my office and if I get you alone, you will never be the same.
I
Mm,
remember that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it would happen to so many people.
Wow. Wow.
Mm.
I want you both to explain when that antenna really started going up, like something is just not right about this man. What were some of his practices? What were some of the things that kind of sparked the exodus from that church? Mommy, you want to start this time?
Yeah. Well, I remember being pregnant with my third child,
Mm-hmm.
and now you have to understand you still have outside influences. There's people who loved me, my mom and my dad. I had people who loved me. I had people from my ex-husband's family who were Christians and was like, this is just not right.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, there was the Guyana and Jim Jones
Oh,
episode.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And, all those hundreds of people drinking that cyanide-laced Kool-Aid
Mm.
and dying in
Yeah.
that episode. That was kind of crowding in on this pastor's influence, but he still had hold of me.
Yeah.
So there were so many other Christians, people who I wanted to have fellowship with, people who loved God that I wasn't allowed to fellowship with
Yeah.
because they didn't go to our church.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I started getting these little nudges from the Creator God inside of me.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have to leave here.
Mm.
Yeah.
And then there was a lot of hatefulness that was being preached over the pulpit.
Yeah.
And if you weren't there,
Oh, yes.
if you didn't come to church, you would be afraid not to come to church because you might be preached on.
Yeah.
You might
Yeah.
be the subject.
Humiliated
Humiliated.
as a form of control, right?
Right.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so and deep down within my spirit, and I did have God inside of me, like saying, you're going to have to leave.
Mm.
I remember the first time God confronted me with, you really need to leave and go.
Mm.
I told God no.
Mm.
I says, I can't leave this church because everybody who respects me goes here,
Yeah.
and everybody who I respect go here.
Yeah.
So my first was no,
Wow.
and so God's a gentleman,
Right.
and he's not going to force you. He's just like,
Oh,
okay,
absolutely not. Yeah. You make
yeah,
your own just choices.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so I had a couple more kids,
Mm.
and
Wow.
yeah,
So you knew before that.
yeah, oh yeah, and
Wow.
then I had a
Wow.
couple more kids. In the meantime, my husband wasn't working, and he wouldn't support us. We got kicked out of our apartment, but before we got kicked out of our apartment, we got kicked out of the church. Because my husband was also getting the unction he had to leave the church,
Yeah.
and so he stood up and he wanted to do it in a respectful way, and he stood up in the church to announce that he was going to resign from the church, and that he wanted the people to know that he wasn't just leaving, that he loved the church, he loved God,
He paid
and
his
he
tithes.
and he paid his
Mhm.
tithes.
Yeah.
But the bishop would not let him get that out.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as my husband stood up and said, "I'm going to leave the church," he says, "Okay, Brother Todd, okay, it's just be quiet and just go."
Mm-hmm.
And Brother Todd said, "No, I just got to finish what I got to say
Yeah.
before I leave." He said, "No, be quiet. And but let me just finish, Bishop." And he says, "In the name of Jesus, Satan rebuke you.
Wow.
You can't finish what you got to say." And then after that, deacons take him out of here.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And so they took him by his arm and escorted him out of the church
Yeah.
because the bishop would not let him finish. He really didn't have anything incriminating to say.
We're going to get to that for a second.
But
But what did he do? He turned his attention to you
he
after Dad left.
first, and then after they took him out, the deacons took my dad out. He cursed
Your
them,
husband.
and my husband,
Uh-huh.
ex. But he says, "I commit your flesh to the devil
Wow.
for the destruction of your flesh.
Wow.
Those were powerful words.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
I commit you to the
church.
devil
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
for the destruction of your flesh."
And then he tried to turn that on
And
you as well.
and then and then I was sitting there at that time. I had just given birth to my fourth child,
Mm-hmm.
and I was sitting there crying, because it was just my family was.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then I was shocked because he turned it on me.
Wow.
And he says, and he turned on me, and it's just like, "And you're his wife, and I commit you to the Satan for the destruction of your flesh
Wow.
and all of your children.
Wow.
And nothing will ever become of you.
Wow.
Nothing is going to ever become of you."
Mm-hmm.
Now, at that point, that broke me from him because
Yeah.
I realized only thing I had done was serve that church,
Yeah.
play piano, walk to church from my house.
And he encouraged you to marry him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Right.
and I had
Right.
nothing,
We
and
forget about that part.
I knew that was the devil,
Yeah.
that was a evil influence that was
Mhm.
cursing me and my children, and it was like the thing that had told me to leave a couple years before
Yeah.
was like, yeah, this is what was manifest.
Yeah.
And so I cried, but it wasn't because I was afraid.
Mm-hmm.
It was just like, no, this curse will have no influence over me and my babies.
Yeah. So, one of the things that we discussed, and this is heavy stuff that I'm about to get into, and then we're gonna ask for your input as well as your story. But the bishop had some worries. He thought that Dad was going to say something.
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the concerns? What do you think he was scared of? We had talked about this.
Yeah, well, soon after we were quote unquote disfellowshipped, there were some prior to that, the bishop and the brothers had a very close relationship.
Mm-hmm.
They had a brotherhood meeting every Tuesday night. I think it was Tuesday night, and they would go, and I mean, seemed like such a powerful gathering between this bishop and the brothers.
Mm-hmm.
But and that was one thing that kept your dad coming, was
That
the
fellowship.
the fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
But then your dad would tell me, and this is from the time we were married, he was like, he's so powerful. And he's like a father figure. He says such powerful things for the word. And I really believe in him. But he says, but whenever he gets me alone,
Mm.
he speaks such pornographic,
Oh my.
dirty, vile things in private with me. And he's trying always to look at my private parts.
Whoa.
And he wants to see my private parts. He wants to know if
And
I
lay
could,
hands.
and well, he did lay hands on his backside because your dad had like
Yeah,
something from
from Vietnam.
Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just some kind of a jungle fungal thing that was on his backside, and the bishops asked him to
Mm.
pray for him and anoint that part of his body
Yeah.
and pray for him. So he had to, you know, pull down his pants and have the bishop pray for him.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
You know, so after we left, some of the elders called us and talked to us and said that they believed uh, that they were afraid that my husband was going to expose him because after a while, brothers started talking one after the other, and it's saying some of the same, having that same testimony
Yeah. Yeah.
that well, the bishop got me alone, and he wanted to see this. He wanted to see my private. He wanted to see how I could please my wife. One brother after the other after the other. So this big powerful brotherhood meeting ended up being so many personal things. Guys don't usually talk about stuff like
Mm-hmm.
this. It happens one on one with another brother
Yeah.
because it was very embarrassing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Absolutely not.
Right.
Yeah. So, Tony, would like for you to speak on when you started to really wake up
Mhm.
and realize that this charismatic leader probably wasn't the voice of God that you thought that he was.
Well, there were two instances.
Okay.
The first one I didn't know because I was so young.
Yes.
So I'll talk about the second instance first, and then the first one I'll talk about because it ties in
Okay.
what she just said.
Yes.
Um, at the time, my uh, husband then started getting a revelation along with other brothers in the church. They call them the young ministers. Um, and the message was so free. And the message was that God loves you. He's a loving and forgiving God.
Mm.
And He's not going to just put you in hell for chewing a piece of gum while you're fasting.
Yeah.
It was just that
Yeah,
bad, you know
yeah,
what I mean?
really, really.
Um,
Wow.
so it was so, I mean, exciting that we had Young People's Night. And Young People's Night before they came on board was, kind of handful of people would show up. But whenever they would preach, they literally took over youth night.
Mm-hmm.
And the church was full with young people.
Mm-hmm.
So much so the older saints started coming as well.
Wow.
And at that time, the bishop just started getting intimidated
Wow.
and felt threatened. But me, it shook the very foundation
Wow.
that I had.
Mm-hmm.
Like, whoa, what's really happening here?
Mm.
So believe it or not, my then husband saw me really depressed. I was just walking around the house so sad and so depressed because the idea of trying to be saved and not make God so angry because I did something wrong was so overbearing and so heavy,
Wow.
and I did nothing wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I never drank, I never smoked. I mean, I never cheated. I was the perfect saint,
Yeah.
right? But yet I felt that,
That heaviness.
yes.
Yeah.
So he convinced me to start listening to other people, other pastors who had the same message. And that's what caused me to leave
Wow.
because listening to other messages, love messages that there's freedom in God, helped me. If it made me feel good and it lifted the heaviness from my shoulders.
Yeah.
So at that time, because of the lies, like I said, the bishop was intimidated by the young ministers, and my husband at the time was one of those ministers,
Mhm.
and he started lying on them and everything. So
Wow.
they all left, and I went with him.
Mhm.
I gained the courage enough to go with him.
Yeah. Yeah.
At that point, I was 21.
Yeah.
But um, and it also made me think about what happened the first instance,
Yes.
that when I knew something might be wrong. I had just gotten married. I was 16 years old, and I went into the his office. For some reason, he summoned me to talk to me,
Mm.
and I'm saying, "Whoa, Bishop really wants to talk to me." So he said, "Sister Toni, so how are you?"
Mhm.
I said, "I'm doing okay." He said, "Well, how's marriage? How are you handling everything? And how, in other words, was intimacy?"
Yeah.
And I said, being a virgin, it was painful.
Yeah.
And I said, "And it's still painful from time to time." He said, "Oh, really?"
Wow.
And then he said, "What's his size?"
Wow.
And I stopped and like, whoa, what kind of question is that?
Yeah.
And it was
Mm.
like, but because he has such of an influence on me,
Yeah.
I hesitated and I motioned house the size.
Mm.
And when I did that, you should have saw the expression on his face
Wow.
that he was literally getting off on
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And I was like, whoa,
Wow.
so fast forward, the stories
Yeah.
came out.
You were piecing stuff together.
Yes,
It
I
was
was
like,
piecing
oh,
it
that doesn't
together.
make sense. So yeah,
Yeah,
it just was one piece that just fit
right.
right in. It
Yes,
finally, once the puzzle was together, that's when the Exodus.
absolutely.
And both of you all had, well, thank God you guys got out, because
Right.
who would have known what our lives would have been like if y'all had stayed in? I know both both of your youngest. I'm your youngest, mommy. Jason's your youngest. You both were out by the time you had your youngest.
Yes.
Yeah, I
Well,
know.
no, my Jessica was.
Oh, just
She
okay.
was the fourth one. Yep.
Oh, wow. Okay.
She
So
was just a baby though.
So Holly was my fourth one before I got out of
okay. Yeah.
We
So
follow each other.
yeah, I mean, so both of you all have, I mean, it's just like, how, where do you get this? Both of you all became best friends, right?
Yes.
Became friends with from the church, married to two only white guys in the church, had 5 children, and we were all born pretty much together. You guys were pretty much pregnant at the same time.
Yes.
So you have 5, my mom has 5, and I know that the church, and we're going to briefly talk about this because I know we're running out of time, but as far as no birth control, Mom, you had said something about if you were not pregnant for more than 6 months, they were looking at you crazy, weren't
Yeah.
they?
You went 6 months between the time you gave birth and and you're not pregnant again.
Wow.
Yeah, you were like, and it was not, you weren't allowed to use birth control. And so that was a sin. Of
Wow.
course, we didn't want to sin and go to hell.
Mm-hmm.
And you weren't even considered having a big family until you had at least 7 kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. And my aunt, your sister was in it. She had 9.
9.
And there was plenty of other women
Oh,
who had
20 big pregnancies this one woman had.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
20,
Wow.
20 births.
births.
Not
She
the,
had
not
more
the,
than
not,
yeah.
not the miscarriages.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, 14, 10, 12. I only have 5.
Wow.
My family's
But if
small.
you all would have stayed in the church, you probably would have kept having them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, me
Wow.
being the younger,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
probably would have had 5 more easy.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Wow. So I know, well, both of you all, after you left the church, obviously there was divorces with both of your husbands, and our fathers. And I just want you to briefly, before we end this, because I feel like there's so much more to cover.
There should
There's
be a
just
part 2.
Yeah, we have to do a part 2.
Yeah.
But I want you to express how it was leaving the church, leaving that structure, and then eventually becoming single mothers, Black women, single mothers of 5 biracial babies, doing it alone. I just want to really quick just get your take on that. Get, your take on the journey. And I know we have to do a part two, but I want to at least kind of give the viewers an understanding of, first of all, where we're going to pick up next time, but also like what that was like.
Well, for me, I didn't know which one that you want.
No, it's
first.
fine, whichever
Okay.
one.
For me, um, I learned later on, much later, the reason my then husband was um, had disappeared for that week. He went on a drinking binge.
Mm,
Had I known that, I wouldn't have married him. So I didn't know that. A year in the marriage, he had, another episode of it. Few years later, it started to get worse when we left the church, and the only thing that kept him from drinking was the fear of going to hell.
wow.
Once we got this new revelation about God as love and everything, he felt more comfortable and relaxed, and he allowed him to have more liberties. And one of those things was alcohol. The unfortunate thing is that the church didn't teach us about healing,
Mm-hmm.
and that, you know, alcoholism is a disease.
Yes.
It is not a character flaw. I want to say that.
Yeah.
He went through a lot of things, a lot of emotional, traumatic things, um, and which caused him not to be the husband and the father that he could have been.
Mm-hmm.
But it was so bad that I struggled with it because that was before I decided to leave. And, I knew that the marriage was doomed, but because of my fear of, of we didn't believe in divorce, that was off the table.
Yeah.
So here I am, a little 17-year-old, 18-year-old. If I divorce this guy, what are my chances of getting married again?
Yeah.
My life is doomed. So I stuck it out, and it nearly killed me.
Wow.
It really did, because as time persists, he started to get worse and more worse and
Mm-hmm.
worse, to the point where um, one of my sisters came to visit me. I was standing at the stove cooking, and she looked at me. She said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You have dark circles. I mean, deep dark circles around your eyes." And I was just cooking, and I was so deep in depression
Yeah.
that I was falling to pieces,
Wow.
and it was, you know. So after I left the church and started visiting other churches that taught about deliverance and freedom and so forth,
Mm.
gave me the strength to say I deserve better
Yeah.
than this. After I could not get him to admit that, first of all, he had a problem,
Yeah.
and secondly, to, go into treatment.
Yeah.
And in matter of fact, I didn't want the influence of that on my children.
Yeah.
So um, I had found the strength somewhere to leave.
Yeah. Yeah.
Packed up all of my five, moved out. It left all the furniture, everything, and slept on the floor for 3 weeks on my sister's floor.
Wow.
Yeah, we didn't have any place to go. So in essence, we were homeless.
Wow.
It had gotten so bad, and the reason why I left, it was starting to get abusive.
Mm.
And yeah, like I said, it was the alcohol that was causing him to do
Yeah.
that. Otherwise, he was a pretty decent man,
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's what happened.
Yeah, that's like you said, alcoholism is I mean, it's a disease. I mean,
Yeah.
all of this addiction, and unfortunately it just stems from like the trauma, and we just think that
Yeah.
it's just like a foothold that
Right.
comes in through our trauma, and we
Right.
medicate through it with it, and
Yes,
yeah, and it tears families apart, unfortunately.
it does.
So, Mom, um, can we get We're going to be closing right after you. So,
Yeah. So once we are shortly after we were kicked out of the church, that church, and we went to um, the
Oh
church
yeah.
that they
We
started
started a church. Yeah.
Tony, and they started a church. Her
Mm-hmm.
her husband and that young minister group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but you're like I had mentioned before, your dad never really caught on to working and supporting us, and so we were evicted from our apartment, and I had just had my fourth child, and so there was no place for us to go, but for me, my husband, and my kids to move with my dad, and so and it was, dad's house really wasn't built for all. I mean, it was tough. My dad he was building a building his church
Mm-hmm.
across the street
yeah.
from his house, and so I remember one day he looked at me, he said, God bless the child that has its own. So that means you get out of my house. It's time for you and your husband and your children to leave.
mm-hmm.
And at that time I had gotten pregnant with you, so we got blessed with a very, very lovely project home.
Good.
And as a matter of fact, it was the newest. It was it was older projects, but it was new because it was renovated from a fire.
Mm-hmm.
5 bedrooms and 2 baths,
Wow.
and that was ours. So I had you, and then
I was the only one of us born in Pittsburgh.
yeah,
Right? Mm-hmm.
everybody else was born.
In Erie. Mm-hmm.
But I had you, and I still had the dream of becoming a nurse.
Yeah.
And at the time, I lived in the projects. Since he wasn't working, I was on public assistance.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I got tired of the looks, going to the bank, using those food stamp dollars. I got tired of the looks, of condescending looks from the people. I could still see them now, looking at me
Mm-hmm.
in that condescending fashion, going to the bank, getting my check. I
Mm-hmm.
could still see the condescending looks,
Yeah.
using them colored food stamp dollars.
I remember. Oh yeah, they were a lifeline though.
Oh
They
yeah.
were,
I
but
remember them.
Yeah.
I did not want that to be the life of my children
Yeah.
in the projects, even though we had a nice
Yeah.
house.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want, and I had that little inkling in the back of my mind,
Yeah.
about nursing school. So
Yeah.
there was an advertisement for a displaced homemakers course,
Yes.
and I took that displaced homemakers course, and I found a way to get back in nursing school
Yeah.
Awesome.
and to get to and that's how we. But as far as your dad, and he kind of went along for the ride,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
but uh, and even though he was the other white brother in the church, and he married one of the black women, he never got over the fact that he was married to a black woman.
Mm. Yeah.
Never got over the fact that he had five biracial children.
Yeah.
Because whenever we went out to any public places,
You walk ahead.
he would walk ahead.
Yeah.
He would turn white as a sheet whenever the people in the restaurant would turn around and focus their attention on this black woman, very, very dark skinned black woman.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know that he couldn't get over it because he didn't have racism. He said that when we got married. But it was a different thing walking that life
It's a very
with a
different.
black woman and 5 little biracial kids.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would go to
In the 80s.
in the
Yeah,
80s,
in the 80s.
In the
70s,
early 80s, 70s and
70s
80s. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would give birth to my children.
Mm-hmm.
He would make sure that there was a brother-in-law or a person, a dark-skinned black person with us,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and he would laugh and talk with them as if I would have had that baby by them,
Yeah.
and he was the ride.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And they didn't realize that he was the husband and the
Yeah.
father of this child.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Walking out of the hospital.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then when we went to Pittsburgh, we didn't have the church community.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I went to, I wanted him to escort me home with Heidi.
Yeah.
And he told me to catch a cab.
Mm.
But you know what? He dealt with mental illness too.
Yes.
He did.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
He
Yeah.
did. So
Absolutely.
after I graduated from nursing
Mhm.
school,
Yeah.
and at that time we were closer to my parents, and the accountability was closer to him,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and and it was very hard for him to deal with that accountability.
Yeah.
And so, as soon as I graduated from nursing school, he said the only way for our marriage to survive is you move back to my hometown. And as soon as I moved back to his hometown in Erie, he left. He left. I got the job, and he left me and my children.
Wow.
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 Can I just say one more
Yes,
thing?
absolutely.
We have so much more inspirational stories to tell. For example, what happened
Afterwards.
afterwards.
Absolutely.
And I think it would help so many young mothers.
Absolutely. And then we're going to end on that note. And the next episode, it's not going to be as heavy.
Yeah.
It might start off heavy, but it
Yes.
will not end heavy.
Yeah, there is light at the end of the tunnel.
There is absolutely, and I'm part of that
Yes,
light.
you are.
If you know,
Very successful,
So I
beautiful
would
young lady.
thank you so much,
Yes.
and I am just so grateful to have you all. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we're definitely going to do a part 2.
Okay.
And I just want the viewers to come and stay tuned for the next episode of Talkish, where we're going to pick back up with my mother and my godmother, Toni. Thank you all for tuning in. You're listening to Talkish.